We're going to start off this morning with a kind of experiment. You can decide if the test results are accurate or not. What I'm going to ask you to do is take your index finger and write a capital letter E on your forehead. If you go ahead and do that now, take your index finger and draw a capital letter E on your forehead. Now, here's the test. Which way did you draw that capital letter E? If you drew it with the lines coming out to the right, which would mean that you would be able to read it if you were looking at it from inside your forehead. Psychologists say that means that you tend to find yourself in a powerful position where you generally expect other people to change to your point of view. On the other hand, if the lines came off to your left-hand side, which would mean that if someone was standing right there in front of you, they would be able to read that letter E. Psychologists say that tends to mean that you are more group-oriented and more open to other people's points of view. How did you do on that test? The basic idea behind that test, of course, is that when we have dealings with other people, how do we negotiate the differences that are there? There's my way and your way. So how do we handle those differences? How do we decide which side wins out? I heard about a young married couple that started attending a particular church. And one week in the bulletin, they noticed that the church was going to have a potluck supper. You know, a dinner where everyone brings something to share. And since that couple liked that church and wanted to get to know more of the people, they decided that they would attend. Well, the night of the potluck supper, they walked into the fellowship hall with the wife carrying a Jell-O salad that she had just made. You know, one of those Jell-O salads that has little pieces of pretzel and marshmallow mixed up in it. And on top, she had put a nice thick layer of Bowen. And when she got there, she then took the Jell-O salad out into the kitchen and handed it to the ladies that were organizing the dinner that night. About 10 minutes later, the pastor said grace and everyone got a plate and started going through the serving lines. But as that husband and wife made their way along those tables of food, they noticed that her Jell-O salad wasn't on the table. The wife said, oh, they probably just put it in the refrigerator and forgot to take it out. And so the wife went out to the kitchen in search of her Jell-O salad. But when she opened the kitchen door, her jaw dropped when she saw the lady in charge of the church supper standing at the sink, scraping her Jell-O salad down the garbage disposal. The church lady turned to the woman and said, "It's okay, dear. You're new here. You didn't know. We don't eat Cool Whip here at this church. We only use real whipped cream." And she continued right on, scraping the Jell-O salad down the drain. As far as that church lady was concerned, there were rules about what kinds of food were permitted to be on the table at church dinners. And according to her, foods that had Cool Whip on them were not allowed. The reality was that back in the first century, they were having that same kind of argument in the church at Galatia. No, they weren't arguing about what was allowed to be put on the table. Instead, they were arguing about who was allowed to be at the table. You see, the church at Galatia had been founded by the Apostle Paul. And it made up primarily, or maybe even exclusively, of Gentiles, of non-Jews, who had come to put their faith in Jesus. And at one point, Peter, one of Jesus' main disciples, who eventually went on to become the leader of the Christian movement, came down from Jerusalem to visit the church in Galatia to see for himself how things were going. And while Peter was there, he warmly welcomed those Gentile Christians and regularly sat down and ate with them. And everything was going along just fine, until one day when some Jewish Christians from Jerusalem also came down to Galatia. And when Peter saw them, he felt torn. And he ended up drawing back from those Gentile Christians and stopped eating with them. Peter did that because the general thinking among many Jewish Christians was that they thought that one of the main ways God wanted them to show their faithfulness was by not associating with unclean Gentiles. And one of the main ways that they were supposed to not associate with unclean Gentiles was by not eating with them. But when Peter did that, when Peter drew back and stopped associating with those Gentile Christians, Paul stood up for those Gentile Christians and really laid into Peter. Basically, Paul said, Peter, of all people, don't you understand what it means to be a Christian? If Jesus has accepted and welcomed these Gentiles as a part of his family, then how can you reject them? Yes, they're Gentiles. Yes, they're different from you. But those differences don't matter anymore. If Jesus has welcomed and accepted them, that is all that matters. If Jesus has welcomed and accepted them, then you should too. It's like some years ago, there was a church that was called the Church of God. Well, one day some differences arose among some of those church members, and some of those church members went off and formed a new congregation that they called the True Church of God. Well, guess what? A little later on, some differences arose among some of the people at the True Church of God. And they went off and formed another congregation that they called the Only True Church of God. Unfortunately, that seems to be all too often our tendency. When we encounter differences, when we run into situations where there's my way and your way, instead of doing the hard work of trying to work through those differences and to find some resolution, all too often we deal with those differences by going our separate ways. But that's not what Jesus wants us to do. No, to love like Jesus wants us to love means to love even those who are very different from ourselves. I recently came across something